We now come to the pivotal moment in these two texts. We can now read of the flood from the Epic of Gilgamesh and also in Genesis. On page 110, we read of the beginning of the flood. It says, "With the first light of dawn, a black cloud came from the horizon. It thundered within where Adad, lord of the storm, was riding. In front, over hill and plain, Sholot and Hanish, heralds of the storm, led on. Then the gods of the abyss rose up. Nergal pulled out the dams of the nether waters. Ninurta, the warlord, threw down the dykes. And the seven judges of hell, the Anunnaki, raised their torches, lighting the land with their livid flame. A stupor of despair went up to heaven when the god of the storm turned daylight to darkness, when he smashed the land like a cup. One whole day the tempest raged, gathering fury as it went. It poured over the people like the tides of battle. A man could not see his brother, nor the people be seen from heaven." And the text continues with this description. It talks about Ishtar, the supposed queen of heaven, bemoaning the deaths of her people. And then on page 111 it says, "The great gods of heaven and of hell wept. They covered their mouths." But having looked at this, it makes you wonder, well, how long was this flood? Well, whenever you look further, you find it was only 6 days and 6 nights. It says on page 111, "For 6 days and 6 nights the winds blew. Torrent and tempest and flood overwhelmed the world. Tempest and flood raged together like warring hosts. When the 7th day dawned, the storm from the south subsided. The sea grew calm. The flood was stilled." Now, this is an impressive account. It's entertaining to read. But whenever you look at this and further passages that we'll look at in just a moment, you'll notice that there's almost no indicator about how high the water was above the mountains, even though there is that similarity. In the Epic of Gilgamesh and also in Genesis, the waters do rise up above the mountains. However, in Genesis, it tells you how much higher the waters were over those mountains. But also, it doesn't really give you hardly any indicators about like time passing other than the 6 days and 6 nights. They don't have that kind of detail. But whenever you look in Genesis, chapter 7 and following, you see that this is different than what's found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In verse 11 and following, it says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And for 40 days and 40 nights the rain was upon the earth." It then also says in verses 17 through 20, "And the flood was 40 days upon the earth. And the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth. And the waters prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high mountains that were under the whole heaven were covered, 15 cubits upward. The waters prevailed, and the mountains were covered." And then you can read in verses 21 and following of the death of the cattle, of mankind, and other things. "And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, from birds to cattle, to beast, and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, and all mankind. All died in whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life, of all that was on the dry land. And every living thing was destroyed that was upon the face of the ground, from man to cattle to creeping things and birds of the heavens. And they were destroyed from the earth, and only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark." So that is impressive destruction, with more details about the deaths of those different animals, and also mankind. But if you look at the very next verse in Genesis chapter 7, verse 24, we get another time indicator. It says, "And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days." But how did the waters recede? How did they go back into the earth? Well, the Epic of Gilgamesh doesn't really speak about that, but Genesis does. In the first 3 verses of chapter 8, it says, "And God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. Also the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters returned from the earth, going and returning, and after the end of 150 days the waters decreased." Now, I previously mentioned about how the waters were over the mountains in both of these texts. But there's also one other thing that happens too that is quite a bit of similarity, where you have the boats that are on their respective mountains or mountain ranges. And you can look in page 111 in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you read about how Utnapishtim's boat is on a particular mountain. I looked for land in vain, but 14 leagues distant there appeared a mountain, and there the boat grounded. On the mountain of Nisir the boat held fast. She held fast and did not budge. One day she held, and a second day on the mountain of Nisir she held fast and did not budge. A third day and a fourth day she held fast on the mountain and did not budge. A fifth day and a sixth day she held fast on the mountain. When the seventh day dawned, I loosed a dove and let her go. This last sentence is a point where it discusses the birds that are released from Utnapishtim's boat, and that's something we'll discuss in the next video. But this mention of the boat being on the mountain is something that's also found in Genesis, in chapter 8, and verses 4 and following. But notice the additional details. And the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month. And the waters decreased, going and returning until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. And it happened at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. And then it discusses the birds, as is the case in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But what about, say, how long it took for the waters to recede in Genesis? Is that described? Well, yes, it is. It's described and it's spoken of not as a mere myth, not as just a legend to explain something, but as a historical reality. In Genesis chapter 8 and verses 13 and following, it reads, And it happened in the 601st year, in the 1st month of the year, in the 1st day of the month, the waters were dried up from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was nearly dried, and the earth was dry in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month. So one reason why we'd want to reject the Epic of Gilgamesh is because it doesn't have any time indicators. It doesn't speak about the waters receding in any real detail. It doesn't give things of that nature. But one reason why I think we could reject it is simply because the gods who brought the flood about are a bunch of cowards. It's because they can't even plan a 6-day and 6-night flood. It said on page 110, after it speaks about how people cannot see in front of them and how they cannot be seen from heaven, it also says that even the gods were terrified at the flood. They fled to the highest heaven, the firmament of Anu. They crouched against the walls, cowering like curs. So we learn from the flood account that the gods in the Epic of Gilgamesh can't even plan a flood correctly. They are cowards whenever it comes. And that is one other reason why we can reject the Epic of Gilgamesh and affirm the Genesis text over it. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.